Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Sarah,
And I'm Nania,
and
and this
this
is
is
horror
horror
slash
slash
stories.
stories. It was a really good effort.
Yes, good enough.
Good enough.
And today, author Lyndall Clipstone joins us to talk about Ari Aster's 2019 folk horror film, Midsommar. Lyndall Clipstone writes dark tales of flower-threaded horror. She is the critically acclaimed author of The World at Lake's Edge duology, Unholy Terrors, and the upcoming Tenderly I Am Devoured. She currently lives in Adelaide, Australia, in a 100-year-old cottage with her partner, two children, and a shy black cat. Welcome, Lyndall.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and I'm so excited to talk about Midsummer.
Welcome. We're so excited to talk to you.
So excited. Oh my God.
So, just to get started, do you consider yourself a horror lover, or what attracted you to the horror genre? If you have like a horror origin story.
I do actually have a horror origin story. So I was really, really into horror, especially books as a teenager. So my young adult reading was things like Anne Rice, Stephen King, and Poppy Z.
Mm.
Brite, who I think is probably one of the most influential authors that encouraged me to become a writer. So I loved horror books, I loved horror films. I used to be really into very gory kind of horror. Even I remember going to the cinema to see Saw, which now I'm sort of looking back, I think, wow, that was very brave because as I sort of got older and had children, I kind of went away from watching horror as much. I didn't feel drawn to it. But when I started writing again professionally, I guess I was drawn back to it a bit more because there was so much aesthetic kind of inspiration in horror. So I think Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak and Pan's
Mm.
Labyrinth were two that really encouraged me to get back into it. So yeah, it's been a bit of a journey, a sort of beginning and an end.
That's awesome. We love Guillermo del Toro.
We do. Crimson Peak is one of my favorite horror movies of all time.
Mine too. I can't
Mm.
believe I didn't watch it when it came out. And I remember my husband's a big film watcher and a big horror film watcher. And he said to me, I told you about it when it came out. And I thought, oh, I maybe just, didn't notice. But it's definitely, especially Lake's Edge, I think has a lot of Crimson Peak vibes.
That makes me so excited to hear. So, would you say that you scare easily? And what do you consider scary and why?
I don't know if I scare easily. Trying to think. Maybe jump scares, yes, but that's
Mhm.
everyone. I find things that generate like a real sense of anxiety to be quite stressful when I watch it, which I'm not sure if that's necessarily in horror. I remember we went to see a stage play of 1984 and just something
Mm.
about which I'd read and knew the plot of, but something about the staging of it and seeing it on stage, I basically had an anxiety attack the entire time through the thing. And the people I went with were like, "Oh, that was great," and I'm just like, "That was horrible."
Oh my
So
God, especially the end.
it was yeah, it was very visceral. So I find, I guess, psychological tension to be
Mm.
the thing that affects me most, and I struggling to think of an example. There's sort of movie moments where there's this real build of ominous, something awful is going to happen, and it's just you're just spending the whole time kind of poised. So I think that is probably the most scary thing for me is the psychological tension. I'm also not a huge fan of gore, but
Mhm.
I don't think that's like it doesn't scare me. I just find it not. I'm not a fan. Like I'm trying to think of his name. The guy that did Hostel, Eli Roth.
Mm.
No, like my husband was watching one of his films and I was in the room and I'm like, I'm gonna have to go now. I can't even have this on in the background. It's very Eli Roth vibes, people being impaled on things, and it's just
Mm.
not for
Oh,
me.
didn't he do that Thanksgiving movie, the Thanksgiving slasher movie? I think that was my first Eli Roth horror movie, and I was like, "Nope."
Yeah, I think the one he was watching, they were in like a nightclub and there was an earthquake or something, and
Oh.
I was like, no, thank you. Like, Roth, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but it's just not for me. So I'm not a big fan of gore, although, like I was saying before we started recording, I really liked the substance. So I'm into David Cronenberg style body horror, which I think is different from, I guess, torture porn, for a better
It's kind of
word.
speculative.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think maybe because there's an aestheticness to that kind of Cronenberg body horror that
Hmm.
I can appreciate, even if it's gross and sometimes I need to cover my eyes. But yeah.
Yeah. You're the second person to mention Hostel. I've never seen Hostel, but it keeps coming up as this movie that is horrible to watch, that people do
I
not like. So I will stay away from it.
feel like in terms of those sort of movies, the first one actually is possibly worth watching just as a really good example of films in that kind of, it was very of its time. Like the first sort of Saw movies and Hostel, I feel like they do add something to the horror genre. Although I think it was either Hostel 1 or 2, and I was watching it, and then I just thought, why am I watching this? I don't want to watch this anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as an author, how do you engage with fear when writing horror or horror adjacent genres like Gothic and dark fantasy?
That's a really good question. I think for me, because one of my favorite things to write about is very intimate, character driven stories, a lot of the suspense comes from the emotional feelings of the characters and the emotional experiences. So I think really leaning into the atmospheric and psychological elements of the horror scenes it's enjoyable as a writer, but also I think it does a lot of work in quite an enclosed narrative when, like in Tenderly I Am Devoured, it's three people in a room or something having like a horror scene. So I really love to play with cinematic elements to try and immerse the reader in this sense of slow, creeping dread, experiencing of doubting reality, being drawn between liminal spaces, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is making me think so much about the movie we're going to talk about, Midsommar. Because, yeah, you were talking about how things that scare you are when the creator gives a sense of anxiety. And I feel that this film is very, embodies that sense of anxiety throughout the film. And it also embodies that kind of like, there's a lot of dialogue. There's more dialogue and more tensions happening between the characters than there are necessarily actions.
Yeah, I think so too. And it was interesting to rewatch it a second time, knowing what was going to happen, because now that I think about it, it was a while ago that I first watched it. And I really wanted to watch it because I was very drawn to how beautifully aesthetic it was. And also the concept of having a horror film set during a daylight summery kind of setting was so unique to me. But I remember having such a sense of building anxiety and dread, and it was actually quite uncomfortable to watch in an
Yeah.
interesting way. Like, not uncomfortable as in I didn't enjoy it, but it was an interesting psychological experience. Yeah, so rewatching it and knowing where it was going helped a bit because I could enjoy it and concentrate on some of the other elements.
Yeah, the dread is very palpable, and I think it's so interesting that Ari Aster is, like, a really anxious person and like, he has a lot of fears, he has a lot of anxieties, and I love that. I love when authors take that thing that is so or not just authors, because he's a film creator, take something that is so, ingrained in yourself and, like, very intimate and just draw that out, and you kinda, like, make yourself vulnerable with this fear, but also create something really cool and beautiful.
I think that's one of the big appeals of experiencing horror in film and in books. I often get asked in interviews, why do you think people are drawn to horror, especially genre blending horror, like romantic horror, like I write? And I think it's nice to see a tense and anxious and dangerous situation played out in a contained, manageable space where you're experiencing it as the reader, but at a safe distance. So you can feel these feelings, but you're not actually mired in it. And also, when it's got a narrative structure, it has like closure, which is, I think, as someone with anxiety, one of the biggest things that I struggle with is loss of control and fear of the unknown, which I'm sure like a lot of
Mm,
people who are anxious find difficult. And so when you've got all of these monstrous horrors contained within a narrative that has a clear ending, that sort of, it's cathartic in a way to experience fear and tension and everything in that sort of environment.
Totally.
definitely. So, where do you think the line is between horror, gothic, and dark fantasy? And how does your work fit into that?
I think it's all in the same kind of ballpark because they do share a lot of the same elements, especially in terms of character driven stories, a very emotional based narrative arc, and the impact on the reader is also quite similar. I suppose it's very sort of evocative, atmospheric. The atmosphere of the book plays a big part of the story itself. But yeah, it's been interesting for me to go from, I guess I've not written one of each because Lake Such is very clearly like Gothic TM. I think it's got the haunted house and the brooding monstrous lord character, and also so much of the things about Gothic that I truly love, like the sentient architecture, this exploration of liminal spaces, um, and just the aesthetics of it in general. There's, shadows and deep water and creeping moonlight, all of those sort of things. It's very Northanger Abbey, Crimson Peak kind of vibes, which I just adore. And then with Unholy Terrors, it became much more second world fantasy based. It was set in a world where they were in like a post war kind of situation where they'd fought a battle against these horrible wolf blood vampiric kind of monsters. And the main character, Eveline, is a bone warden who's part of a necromantic sect that guards a wall made of bones. So I always pitch it as if it was the wall at Game of Thrones, but the Night's Watch was a bunch of teenage girls. So these necromancer sort of characters who use bones of their enemies as armor to do magic to maintain these wards that keep the realm protected from the encroaching threat. And even though the plot in that was very, as everything I love to write, character driven, intimate, small stakes, the main story was basically about Eveline navigating her relationship with her father and her half sister and discovering the truth behind her mother's death and why she couldn't work magic like the other wardens. But the world around it was very expansive because we had gods and battles and this whole sort of legacy, this big belief system of the saint that they worshipped and the god that they were fighting against. And yeah, so I think so there's that with dark fantasy, that it's a bigger world. There's a lot more going on, even if you're just narrowing in into one tiny little part of it. And I always think of Tenderly I Am Devoured as a romantic folk horror because it's still a second world setting, but the world that I used was very much based on the real world rather than me wanting it to feel like a fantasy world. So I'm not sure. Like, I really love books that do that, where it's second world, but basically just an alternate version of our own reality. So I'm trying to think of a good example. Like Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross, I think was a really good, even though that's more fantasy than folk horror, but I think she did a really good job of creating this. It has a very like post-war World War II London feel, even though it's a completely different world. And I wanted it to feel more grounded in reality, I suppose, than a dark fantasy. So it's less expansive. It's just everyday life kind of things. In a way that makes the horror even more threatening because the world is so much
Mhm.
smaller and less fantastical. Like the threat is coming from within with the small kind of small stakes psychological tension.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's one thing I love about your work is that the horror in your work is so transformative that it shapes the characters as much as their relationships that they have with each other. And I think that's the most interesting kind of horror, the kind of horror that changes someone.
I think so too. I love character-driven stories, as a reader and as a writer. Like, the smaller stakes, the better. I'm such a fan of this very personal narrative journey, and I think partly, I mean, it's hard to gauge why, but I think maybe one of the reasons that so many people have resonated with Tenderly I Am Devoured is because Lark's journey is such a relatable experience. She's in this liminal space between high school and college. And even many years later, I still remember that feeling of going home for the summer after high school had finished. And you're in this sort of break before your real life as an adult starts, and everything just feels so big and full of potential, but also scary because of how big and full of potential it is. And you're just sort of waiting for life to begin. So she's got kind of this very relatable situation that I think a lot of people can see in themselves. And a lot of her experiences outside of the horror are almost more terrifying or difficult to deal with because she's had this very difficult friendship breakup. She's lost this very secure sense of her future that she's worked very hard towards. She's got this troubled relationship with her former childhood crush slash heartbreak who's come back into her life. So I think there's a lot going on that almost foregrounds the horror, where the threat of the supernatural with Therion, her husband, and his world encroaching on hers is almost less scary than the real life things that she's facing, or maybe alongside. It's this beautiful parallel of, yes, it's scary to deal with the wrath of a god, but it's also really scary to face trusting again after having your trust broken. And I really love that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to say I love the aesthetic in Tenderly I Am Devoured. I love the fairy tale feel of it. And it's not only is it like the imagery beautiful, the way you express it is so like unique and lyrical. So, drawing on that, you've mentioned that you are very passionate about flower threaded horror, horror where there is a deceptively beautiful aesthetic hiding in the terror. What how would you define this aesthetic and its purpose, and what draws you to this subgenre?
I think you could also call it, I saw someone call it cottage gore the other day, or dark cottage gore,
I love
dark
that.
cottage core. I
That's
love
so
that
cool.
too. And I think that was one of the things that drew me to Midsummer as well, this idea of, when you think of horror, you think of dark and shadows and tense, sort of scary, ominous, which obviously is also a big part of horror. But I really, really love the contrast between having a beautiful, flowery setting and a lot of creeping dread. And I think a lot of folk horror really captures that very well. Things like Wicker Man, or I'm trying to think of another one that was a really evocative folk horror, and now my mind has gone blank. But this kind of that era of these sort of 1970s British folk horror where it's all flower threaded and maypoles and summer festivals, and then suddenly the horror creeps in. So I really
Mhm.
like to use the term flower threaded horror. I think it just encapsulates what I'm trying to do, which is this aesthetic, beautiful world that also hides so many dangers and creeping, ominous threats.
Yes. So your
Yeah,
books have
absolutely.
a folkloric horror element to them, since you've brought that up. And they have underworld gods and rituals and sinister bargains. What sorts of folklore, legends, or fairy tales inspire you?
I am a big Greek mythology girl, as so many authors probably are. I've always loved the myth of Hades and Persephone, particularly, I think, for so many reasons. But when I was thinking more deeply about it the other day, I was thinking about how well it engages with that liminal kind of transformative experience in life. She's literally in this liminal space between worlds. She's going from being a daughter to a bride, all of these things. And I think, as someone who loves to play with these sort of spaces between, both in terms of a setting and a character's emotional development, something about that really draws to me. I also really love works that take the sort of classic structure of a fairy tale and then use it in a unique kind of way. Angela Carter's work has always been really, really inspirational to me because of that. I just love how she puts this very brutal, modern, feminist edge on a classic narrative. And I think there's something fun about taking a structure that people are familiar with and doing something new because people go into it feeling a sense of connection. So, yeah, I think classic fairy tales, the kind of Grimm's fairy tales, Greek mythology. I also really love Orpheus and Eurydice. I think there's a lot of elements of that in my work. This sort of doomed girl being drawn into like a different world, and then the one who has to go and rescue her. And yeah, I think that sort of thing.
Awesome choices.
Thank you.
I agree. So, what do you hope readers take away from your books?
I It's always so hard to decide. I think one of the hardest, and it's simultaneously the hardest and most beautiful parts of being a writer, is that you create a story which feels so personal to you, and then you send it out into the world, and there's so many different ways that people can interpret, receive, interact with the book, and it's kind of amazing how it takes on its own life like that. So to begin with, I really just hope people enjoy themselves. I love the idea of someone picking up a book and being completely immersed in it, sitting down, reading it all in one night. And I hope that it reaches the readers who need to feel seen or whatever message resonates from the story. You know, there's particular books that you just pick up and it hits you at the right time in your life. I'd love to be that book for readers. So yeah, I hope it finds the readers who need that particular story at that particular time.
That's beautiful. And I definitely feel that
Hmm.
your book does give that immersive experience. And I think that's so cool.
So, if you had to recommend 3 books or movies that were the right book at the right time for you, for other readers, in addition to your own books, of course, which 3 books or movies would you recommend for horror?
Well, that's a good question. Which is like my brain now forgets every book and movie I've ever seen. So the first one would have to be The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which I picked up at random in a bookstore in Amsterdam when I was in my early 20s. And I think I'd read another of her books, The Little Friend, just I picked up because I liked the cover and I needed a book to read on a flight, on a long haul flight back to Australia. And I was like, oh, Donna Tartt, I liked her other book. I'll read this one. And it was just right place, right time. I was in like the final year of my undergraduate degree and feeling so many complicated emotions about academia. I sort of loved it, hated it, was really scared to go out into the real world. And there was just something about the characters, particularly Richard. I always like to joke that I wish I was Camilla, but I'm definitely Richard, this kind of misfit wanting desperately to be part of this insular in crowd and always kind of orbiting around the edges of it. And I just felt so seen by him. And I know he's a very flawed character, and maybe it's not a good thing to say that you identify with Richard from The Secret History, but a lot of the elements of his wanting to belong and wanting to sort of rewrite the narrative of his own life and things like that in an academic setting were very resonant to me at the time. And also just the beautiful lyrical slow pace of the story. I just loved it so much, and I think it's something that I go back to again and again. It's probably one of the books that I've reread the most. So yeah, number one, A Secret History. I'm trying to think of a film that's one that I watch and rewatch. um
I'm definitely going to be checking out The Secret History
Yeah,
now. That
I hope
sounds
you
amazing.
enjoy it. It's one of those things where I gave it to my mum to read, thinking that she would really love it because I loved it so much. And she's like, "This book is stupid. I hate all of these kids. Like, they need to go and do something more productive." You have a point.
Mom.
So that was clearly not the right book at the right time for her. But That was one of them. I think another would be Roshani Chokshi's Last Tale of the Flower Bride, which I have always loved her writing. She is the most beautiful lyrical writer, but Last Tale of the Flower Bride just hit all of the right things for me. I think I read it at a time where I was really struggling creatively with the direction I wanted to go as an author with Unholy Terrors, which was a very dark fantasy book. It had a really quiet release. Often people don't even know. They're like, oh, I didn't know that you'd written another book. I'm like, yes, I have. So it had a really, really quiet release. And it sort of sent me into this burnout, which had probably been a long time coming, where I had this moment of like, do I even want to keep writing? Is this all this anxiety and unknown worth it? And a big part of that was reevaluating what sort of stories do I really want to tell? And the answer to that was I wanted to be more literary. I wanted to be more lyrical. I wanted it to be smaller stakes, more intimate, more grounded in the real world, I suppose, more personal. And there was something about the way that Last Tale of the Flower Bride was structured that helped unlock that for me. So it was this her beautiful lyrical writing, the way that she played with the back and forth of the narrative, because she's got the current timeline and then the past timeline, and the fairy tale elements that were drawn into it, but redone in such a new and fresh way. So that's another book that I'll often just pick up and reread passages out of, especially when I'm working on something myself and I want to get a sense of like how to get into the zone of that lyrical writing. It's one of those, it's like reading poetry, I find, with her work, but particularly that book.
That's really cool.
And for a movie, gosh, I don't know. There's so many. Um, Thinking of one that has been one that I watch over and over again and find really inspirational, I guess I'd have to say Labyrinth, which
Oh, yeah. A good
um,
one.
and it's funny because I feel like maybe in Lake Sedge there's some sort of labyrinthy elements, but it's interesting because I've loved it so much. I watched it as a kid. I think there's probably like a whole generation of us millennials who imprinted on David Bowie and his leggings in the 90s, and I've been chasing that ever since. But weirdly, it hasn't actually impacted, like, it hasn't taken shape in anything I've written. I've kind of deliberately tried to keep a distance between doing an homage to Labyrinth in my own writing, just because I think it's so of itself. Like it really just, it's so unique. And I don't know that there's a way to reproduce it that I could do justice to, but there's just, it's just so visually beautiful and this perfect mix of sort of whimsy and horror, but also the way that it captures that liminal between time of teen going into adult. I mean, how old is
Mhm.
Sarah in the film? Is she meant to be 15 or 16?
Somewhere around there,
Somewhere
I
around
bet.
there. And there's just all of these really beautiful teen girl details that I absolutely adore when you rewatch it. I remember finding, I think it was a Tumblr post where someone had screenshots of all of the bits of Sarah's room, and there's all these little clues. There's like a photo of her mum from a newspaper clipping, and she was an actress, and her co-star was looked like David Bowie. So there's this idea that like she sort of imagined this whole world out of all the elements in her room, and that kind of fractiousness between her parents and her. And it's funny watching it as an adult and thinking, actually, you're being a little bit unreasonable. I'm from the other side now. Now I'm the parent, and I'm just like, yeah.
Mm.
But I just love it so much.
That's what makes it so timeless.
It does. It really does. And it's got that beautiful timelessness to it. It's got a real like John Hughes timelessness to the way it looks that I think apart from the CGI owl at the start, which was I heard was one of the first instances of 3D CGI, which is very funny. Even the owl is still he still holds up pretty well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's so timeless and I think so relatable that it resonated with me as a child, as a teenager, even now as a grown up. There's just something about that real sort of clinging to the familiar, wanting to break out and face the scariness of the adult world, but also not sure if you're ready to leave. I loved all of that alongside with the kind of romantic elements, which, like narratively it made a lot of sense for her not to stay in the labyrinth, but the toxic romance fan of me is like, but what if?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, but what if? Um, I'm going to move us on to the talking about the movie discussion portion of this
Ooh.
interview. We have this tradition of a 60-second recap of the movie, and we like to invite our guests to do the 60-second recap. But however, you are not required to. If you would like to opt out, you are totally welcome to opt out. But I am preparing a timer for whoever does it.
Okay, I can try. I'll see. I love it's probably like my brain when you asked me which movies and books would be an inspiration. And my brain's like, did we watch Midsommar last night? Did we? But I will do my best.
Okay, I'm going to count you down.
Okay.
Ready, set, summarize.
Okay, so the film centers on a girl called Danny whose family has just died in a horrible murder suicide kind of accident. She has the world's worst boyfriend, Christian, who, along with his anthropology student bro friends, all go to Sweden for the summer to do some research or maybe just have a fun summer trip. And she tags along. They go to a remote pagan-esque community in country rural Sweden, and things just continue to get weirder and weirder as they witness the rituals that occur there. But alongside that is also Danny's emotional journey of learning to process her own emotions, learning to get rid of her terrible, terrible boyfriend. And
10 seconds.
yeah, and then it culminates with Danny becoming the May Queen and a weird sort of psychedelic kind of ritual where it's very good for her. Did I get that?
You nailed
I
it.
did.
Right on time.
Yay.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, that's awesome.
So tell us.
Yeah, I was really
Oh, I
sorry.
was going to ask you why you picked this movie for us today.
I originally picked it because I felt like it was the most comparable to the vibes of Tenderly I Am Devoured because the summer setting of the horror and the flower threaded horror of Midsummer was one of my big inspirations when I decided to write Tenderly I'm Devoured. So I felt like it would be fun to talk about the movie as an inspiration. And it was really fun to revisit it because it had been a while since I'd watched it too. So going back into that world after I'd written a book with that kind of inspiration was really fun.
That's really awesome. And it kind of inspired us because our season 1 theme was possession. And as we were trying to decide a theme for season 2, we were just like, what about Midsommar? Like, what if we made this episode like our first episode and then we go into a folk horror season? And so you kind of really inspired us here. But yeah, so we're focusing on this season 2 on folk horror films. And I want to ask a few questions. First of all, is it folk horror? Like, how does this film draw on folk horror predecessors or add to the genre? And what does this movie contribute to the horror canon? So I've just asked, my problem is I'm constantly asking like a million questions at once. But I think it's interesting because I want to hear like what each of you think about is it folk horror? But I know that for Ari Aster, he said for him, it's not folk horror. For him, it's a macabre fairy tale. He said for the men in the film, it's folk horror. But for Danny, it's a macabre fairy tale.
I love that. I think I would consider it folk horror adjacent in that it definitely draws on a lot of the aesthetics and tropes of the folk horror. And yeah, for the men, it's very much like it's got a very like Wicker Man kind of vibe for the men. But you're right. I think the emotional journey that Danny goes through is definitely more of a fairy tale esque journey through the woods kind of story versus it being a folk horror. I think it's just this beautiful blend of elements. I love, and maybe that's why I love it so much because it takes a lot of the folk horror elements and does this really interesting, fresh take with them, the way that it really puts Danny's emotional journey and her growth as a woman at the center of it.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Nenia, what do you think?
So I feel like the fear in Midsummer for the women is different. I think for the women, it's the fear of self and like the fear of like what you could become if you just decided to abandon all of your scruples and just like revert to like your inner nature and like F everyone else. Because I do feel by the end she'd kind of become like, I don't want to spoil anything, but I do feel like her experiences had like transformed her into something that was completely different, where she almost became part of the horrors, which I really liked.
Hmm.
I love that too. I think when I was saying in my recap, it's a bit of a good for her narrative, but it's
Yeah.
almost like an overcorrection for her because we see her at the start where there's all these images of her like holding in when she's crying. She's always shoving her hands over her face. And even when she's crying in the early scene where Christian goes to her to comfort her after her family dies, and she's always saying like, no, no, no. Like it's almost like she's saying no to her own emotions. And it's like this real dark fairy tale kind of feeling of this is what happens if you deny or or you're silence, because there's this she's got this horrible boyfriend and all his friends are like, oh, you know, daddy, she needs to go to a therapist, she's
Yeah.
so needy, all she does is cry, she never wants to have sex with you, you know, get rid of her and find somebody better. And she's been sort of so shut down. And I think it's a very common kind of experience of this idea of like making yourself smaller and more palatable to the point where all of this emotion that she's squashed back in really explodes out and it almost goes completely in the other way. And I think those images of her at the end where she's wearing the May Queen outfit, this big flowing, she's almost like the landscape, the hills that are behind
Hmm.
the I'm trying to think of the word, like, it's not a camp, the settlement that they're in. They've got these beautiful sort of flowing hills that surround them. She is almost becoming part of, like you were saying, she's becoming part of the horrors. And I love this idea of it being this kind of extreme, getting to a point where, like, perhaps it could be like a equilibrium and then surpassing it.
Yeah, she was passive and carried along by her boyfriend, and then she decided to become passive and carried along by the horrors instead.
Yeah, it's interesting because it was interesting watching it and wondering, is it really like a triumphant narrative for her, or is she sort of a victim of the horrors as well? Like I don't know that she has like a real final girl kind of vibe, or maybe she does. Like, I guess thinking about this is a completely different type of film, but that final scene at the end of Texas Chainsaw Massacre with the final girl where like
Hmm.
she's escaping, but she's blood drenched and traumatized. She's got that kind of, you know, like she's survived, but she hasn't emerged unscathed.
This is kind of a question
That's
for everyone. Like, do we think that this movie was scary? Why or why not?
Well, this was originally a movie that was on my never want to see again list, because of the scene with Danny's family at the beginning was really disturbing. And then there's the scene where there's the ritual of the older people ending their lives, and that was really disturbing. And at first, I watched Hereditary, and I was like, "This is probably the best horror movie I've ever seen. I never want to watch it again." And this was, my second Ari Aster film. And I think I was still kind of had that lingering, like, oh man, this person really just wants to traumatize his audience. But then Nenya and one of our other friends, we ended up rewatching the movie earlier this year, and I loved it. And I really appreciated it more than I did the first time because I think on the second watch, you already know the plot, you know what's going to happen. So the shocking elements are less disturbing, and you're able to focus more on the nuance and on the details and the message. And I think it really is a layered and beautiful film. And I think I think I recall someone originally saying that this was supposed to be like a slasher in like I think that was the original idea. So I do like the idea of Danny kind of as a final girl in that sense. And then, oh my gosh, there was one other thing I wanted to say. Oh, about repression. Sorry, this is back to folk horror, but then I will talk about it if it's scary. But yeah, I think that there's a theme in folk horror of like repression and freedom, or like and that's like a freedom of emotion, or like the opposite of repression, and there's that dichotomy. That's a kind of that's the struggle in a folk horror film, and I think that's so interesting that I didn't really notice before, that yeah, Danny was repressing her emotions, and then she comes to this community where she doesn't have to be responsible for everyone, and she doesn't have to worry about behaving a certain way because they're so accepting of her, and they're just like, you're meant to be here, you belong here. And then they have that collective grieving moment together, and that's really yeah, really cathartic.
I feel the same about the film. I think I have never watched Hereditary, and I'd heard about it. My husband is a big horror film watching fan, and I think he watched it with his sister. She's his like buddy for all the horror movies that I'm too scared to watch. And I think the reputation of Hereditary really preceded Midsummer because they were released quite close together. There was a lot of discussion about how Hereditary was quite discomforting. Maybe that's an understatement to watch. And so I went into Midsummer knowing that I'd been too frightened to watch Hereditary, and kind of expecting or apprehensive about what it was going to be like, but still wanting to watch it anyway. So the first time I watched it, I had quite a big sense of anxiety, and it was almost the unknown and the creeping dread and these very slow build ups to the emotional moments and the slow build up to the horror, even, which when you don't know where it's going, you're just kind of on the edge of your seat the whole time. You're like, great, when's the. And I think that scene you were talking about with, I suppose, Danny's family, I found that more confronting the second time I watched it. I think the first time, because I didn't know where it was going, I was kind of confused. I was like, wait, what's happening? But the second time I knew, and I could actually really appreciate the slow dread and the imagery of it. Like you've got that bright yellow hose snaking through the house, and this sort of the slow build up of how she's been emailing, and it's this very kind of starting small and slowly going out. And then you have the same thing when they get to the community where there's something off. You can't really pinpoint why. There's just something that feels weird. Maybe it's like the drawings, the weird elements in some of the drawings on the decorate the buildings, and then there's like the dinner where everybody's sort of sitting and they can't really understand what's going on because they're speaking Swedish, and then it leads to like, and now we're going to this procession, and it's like, oh, okay, this took a turn. So I think I found those, I don't know if scary would be the word, confronting maybe, but I definitely felt a big sense of anxiety when I was watching it the first time. That knowing where it was going when I rewatched it helped me appreciate it in a different way and enjoy it a lot more.
I agree. Nenya, was it scary for you?
Think it was more disturbing than scary. Like for me, what makes a movie really scary, like, is if the bad stuff or the killings is random. And for me,
Hmm.
it felt like the violence in Midsummer was very ordered because everyone who was killed or had bad things happen to them had violated some sort of taboo within the settlement. Like they were told not to do something or that something was sacred and that they shouldn't touch it or go there. And they did it anyway. So I'm a very rule abiding individual, and I'm thinking in my head, well, I wouldn't do that. So I would not be killed probably. So, like, I feel like not knowing is what makes it terrifying for me. And so,
Mm-hmm.
because it followed its own twisted logic, it was just more twisted and visceral and hard to watch, but not really scary.
Mm-hmm. Um, I want to ask us two final questions before we move on to the rating, and they're kind of related. Is there a villain in this movie? And does the movie have a moral or a message? And I would love to know either of your thoughts, both of your thoughts, because I've heard some people say that Pele is the villain. And, if he's the villain, it's a dark romance for me.
I definitely think he's nefarious. I mean, he's this kind of catalyst. And then there's that bit at the end, which I missed the first time I watched it, where he's kind of rewarded for bringing them into the community. And, but it's sort of like I guess it's a very folk horror-esque question because is he a villain or is he just a part of the workings of their society? Because clearly they're this very insular community that needs to bring in outside people for the longevity of their existence. But I guess due to the interesting nature of their lifestyle, obviously it's not like they can recruit people because the more people that come in, the more their very insular way of life is under threat. So they've got this really interesting solution to it where they send people out on a pilgrimage and they bring back
Mhm.
people from the outside, but whether those people stay as members of the community or serve in other ways. So I guess he is a villain in a way that he brings them there with a hidden purpose, which isn't
Mhm.
in their best interests. And he's clearly handpicked Danny to begin with. I mean, it's almost one of those things where, like, watching it, I felt kind of sad for her because I don't think she gets the empowerment that you kind of want her to get because she sort of goes from being sort of connected to and doing everything for this approval of this useless boyfriend that she's got who doesn't treat her the way that she deserves to kind of being almost manipulated into the role of the May Queen because it's clear that Pele has sort of picked her out as who he wants or he thinks will be a good May Queen and he wants her for that role. But whether that serves her best interests or not, I don't know. Like it's almost kind of like it's sort of she doesn't have the element of choice that you'd like her to sort of have. And so he is sort of villainous in that way. I find that interesting. But
Mhm.
I think for me, maybe it's this kind of very folk horror, fairy tale esque thing where the it's the contrast between humanity and nature or the primal and the modern because you've got the modern world coming into nature and nature's sort of reacting or harming them, but is it malicious or is it just this intersection of and I think having them being these anthropology students who want to come and study the community, but in a very selfish way, which I found really interesting when I rewatched it, that they're not respectful and they're only interested in how the uniqueness of the community can serve them. And that argument between Christian and the other
Josh.
Josh, uh, his both of them don't really have particularly pure intentions in terms of anthropologizing the society. But there's this argument between them about like who gets to have the thesis, like, oh, I've decided now, like I want to do my thesis on this too. And like the way that Josh steals the holy book or goes to photograph it after he's been told not to. Like there's this real sort of like greed to them where they're coming in and sort of thinking about how can I use this for my own benefit out in the modern world. So the way that they do get punished for transgressing that kind of boundary is interesting too. I'm not sure if that answers whether there's a villain or not. Maybe, I don't know, like possibly. I'm really interested to hear what you think.
Yeah, Nanya, what do you think? And I don't think there has to be like a solid answer. I think it can be.
Sometimes
I
when
love
it's
that.
vague, it's the best. So
Yeah.
Oh, I'm on the carpet now. Uh, I feel like there's two villains, but I don't think they're the people. Well, so I think one is groupthink. Like I think people do very
Mm.
dangerous things when it's set as like the precedent for a community and kind of accepted and even like, encouraged by everyone. And I also feel like There's also a very anti-colonialist narrative, like Lyndall was saying, where, you come into a community as an outsider who has impure interests, and you basically want to exploit like other communities for your advantage. And it really did feel like the moral of the movie was, punishing that. But I also feel like it's a cautionary tale too, because we as like the outside observers are seeing this society that is doing truly like heinous and brutal acts of violence to its own people. And I think sometimes it takes like an impartial third party observer to see that sometimes like a society's objective morality is actually very corrupt and problematic and even brutally unfair.
I think
Mhm.
that's a really good point. And I think when you were saying before that all of the people who get killed are kind of deserving of the retribution, the only ones who weren't were the British, like the young British couple who the
Mhm.
actor was played by Farley from Saltburn. So I didn't realize that until I rewatched it. I was like, oh, it's him. And I guess their only crime was the moralistic reaction to the ritual where the elders gave their lives. Like oh, this is horrible. We're leaving because this is, this is inhumane. Like this is not. And they were stopped from leaving because they were kind of this voice of opposition to the ways of the community. And I think that really reinforces that idea of, yeah, the villainousness of their way of life.
They violated the rules, but like, are the rules fair and just?
Hmm.
What do you think, Sarah?
If I had to pick a villain, I don't know if that he's the villain, but like Christian is just very hateable.
It
Yeah.
really is. I think, is he a villain or is he just a jerk? Like,
That's a good point. Yeah, yeah, because he's not like actively scheming, but I think you said it best in terms of like what the villains are, and I think that's a really cool that it's these like things, not necessarily characters. Does the movie have a moral? It's hard for me to say. I'm wondering like what was he trying to say with this film? What is the moral? It reminds me a lot of Incantation, just as we were talking about like the trespassing, the doing something you shouldn't. That's where also you have, if you've seen Incantation, this group of young people go to an insular village where they are observing and filming the rights of this community, even though they've been asked not to. And they want to break into this sacred tunnel, and they do it in a very like violent way, very disrespectful, and then, have to deal with the curse results afterwards. So I do think there's this theme of like this cautionary theme of trespass, but I don't know that it has a clear message, but I like that it's layered, and I think that you can draw a different meaning from it each time you watch it.
I think so too. And I don't necessarily feel that it needs to have a huge message. Like, I think the experience of participating in it by watching it, and probably it's like I was saying before about my book, it's one of those things where it's nice for people to bring their own emotional kind of layers to it and their own interpretation based on how they interact with it personally. But that does make me interested. I'll have to look up and see if there's any interviews with Ari Aster where he talks about what he intended for the message of the film to be, if there is, if
Hmm.
it's ever talked about it.
I'm really curious. Have either of you seen The Death of a Unicorn,
No,
like
but
his
I
new
have
film?
that on my list of things to watch just because I saw some film stills from it and it looked really cool. So,
I think it's really different from his other movies, but it also has these similar threads of like there are some disturbing moments. There's a lot of family tension, and then there's also the tapestries. He draws a lot of art and visuals into
oh,
his films, I
cool.
think.
I'm feeling very inspired to watch a lot of films now. So I'll add that. And I haven't seen Incantation either, but that sounds really good. So I'll add that one to the list as
It's really good. It will freak you out.
well.
So, how would we rate the movie from 1 to 10 on overall quality and overall scariness?
I can go first.
Yeah, sure.
Where am I at for scariness? Well, I mentioned that, yeah, originally I was like, I'm never watching that again. Oh, I'm going to give it It's not scary to me, but it is disturbing. It's very disquieting. Dread is a good description for this movie. So I'm going to give it, I think, a 7 for scariness, and that's mostly for those 2 scenes we've talked about. Overall quality, I think I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to say about a 6 out of 10 for scariness because I think the ominousness and the psychological tension is definitely a huge factor of it. And yeah, I don't know. I'm having like trauma flashbacks to all of the like ratings that like as an author, I'm sure many you can relate. You're like, what was it worth? 2 out of 5 stars. Did not like. I don't know. I think yeah, like 8 or 9 out of 10. I
Mhm.
really love it. I'm very uncritical when I consume media though, because I think it's just nice for me to enjoy something. And so, unless I really, really hated something, I'm generally happy to just have a good time. And it has a lot of elements. It really held up when I rewatched it. Aesthetically, it's beautiful. The plot didn't have any moments where I was just sort of like, what? I think there's a couple
Mhm.
of bits where the dialogue is kind of clunky, but that sort of adds to the like building of the tension too. Like the scene where Danny and Christian are having they have this sort of big fight and then it's like they're about to break up and then she walks off and she's like, don't leave me here. And I'm like, no, let him go. And I remember the dialogue in that sort of scene felt a bit like, I don't know, it wasn't my favorite, but it's such a minor thing. Overall, like it's really visually beautiful and the narrative of it is so enjoyable too.
Mhm.
I agree with both of you. I think I'd give it like a 6 for scariness just because of the dread and the horror and the gore. And I think I'd give it an 8 because it's not the type of thing I'd normally watch, but the cinematography was so beautiful and I was invested enough that I wanted to see it to the end.
I mean, I did sit through
Yeah.
the 3 hour director's cut version last night.
Oh my gosh, what's the difference? I've been wanting to, like, find out what the difference is between the director's cut and the final
I
cut.
mean, it's been such a long time since I watched the first one that it's hard to say, but I think to me it just seemed like there was a lot of long shots. So it was like a lot
Mm.
of really long, drawn out sort of camera panning, soundtrack building kind of shots. So I don't know that it wasn't like watching the director's cut of Lord of the Rings, where it's kind of like it really adds to the story. I feel like a real, immersive experience of Lord of the Rings kind of fan. I don't think it needed I don't think it added anything to the film except for just an extra layer of richness to the experience. It
Mm.
made the slowness and the languor and the ominousness really emphasized.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to me how this film, I feel, kind of sparked this revival of folk horror. And I also really admire the way it clearly drew inspiration from The Wicker Man, but it's so unique. It's so its own thing. And I think really like Danny and her story arc makes it that different because they are parallel in so many ways. But before we wrap up today, Lyndall, where else can people find you and your work? And tell us when your book is coming out. Tenderly I Am Devoured.
So Tenderly I Am Devoured comes out on the 1st of July all over the world in the UK, North America, and Australia. And you can pre order it at wherever books are sold or request it at your library. And online, you can find me at LK Clipstone on socials or at lyndallclipstone.com.
Beautiful. Thank you.
And is there anything else that you would like to share, either about you or about your thoughts about the movie or horror, just anything you'd like?
So the beautifully redone paperback re-release of Unholy Terrors actually comes out on the same day as Tenderly I Am Devoured. It's got a gorgeous new cover, which I love so much, and there's some fun extra things in the back of the paperback. So I feel like if you're going to the bookstore in North America where it's coming out, you definitely deserve both of the books. I'm so excited to see them next to each other. So that's my little extra thing.
The cover is gorgeous. The covers for both of them are
I
gorgeous.
know I got so lucky. I really love how the Tenderly I'm Devoured cover went so far away from like a dark fantasy look. It's so pastel and floral and beautiful.
Hmm.
It's so perfect.
It really is. Yeah. So I guess I'm going to wrap us up and just say thank you, everyone, for listening to Horror/Stories. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you gave us a review or shared the episode with a friend. And if you're interested in being a guest on the show or recommending a movie for us, especially a folk horror movie, you can find a link in our Instagram bio at horror/stories_pod.
And don't forget to subscribe to the show and follow Lyndall on social media. And thank you so much for listening. Bye.
Bye.